All right, let's get right into it. We're going to tackle a classic problem in the Oracle e-business suite world, one that I'm sure a lot of you have run into. It's that tricky situation where you need to manage one single product, but you're sourcing it from tons of different suppliers. So how do you handle that? Let's dive in. So picture this, right? You've got one product, just one SKU, but you buy it from 31 different vendors. 31! You've got some coming from domestic suppliers, others are imported, and of course they all have different costs. Heck, maybe even the quality varies just a little bit. The big question is, how on earth do you keep track of all that in your inventory system without it just turning into a complete and utter mess?
And this quote, this right here, it hits the nail on the head. This is the root of the whole problem. You see, Oracle EBS inventory at its very core thinks in terms of items. It knows things by their SKU, their item number. It was never really designed to say, okay, I have SKU 123, but is it the one from vendor A or vendor B? That little detail, that vendor attribute, isn't part of its DNA. And that single design choice is what creates this entire business headache we're trying to solve.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll dig into the core problem. Then we'll look at 3 different ways to solve it: adding a tag, creating some sub-items, or just fixing it with reporting. After that, we'll compare them side by side and wrap it all up with the final verdict. All right, let's kick things off with the problem itself, because this isn't just some academic exercise, right? There are real-world constraints we've got to deal with. So here are the ground rules. They're determined to stick with one main inventory item, one SKU, but they're sourcing it from all 31 of those suppliers. And critically, they have to be able to track costs and margins for each and every one of those suppliers. Now here's the kicker, the absolute deal breaker. Creating 60 or 80,000 new SKUs is completely off the table. No way. It would just break everything operationally. So we're looking for that perfect solution that somehow threads this very, very fine needle.
Okay, on to option 1. What if, instead of messing with the item itself, we just add a tag? A tag for every single batch that comes in the door. This is what we call the lot control strategy. The idea behind this is, well, it's actually pretty elegant. You keep that single SKU, you don't change it, but every time a shipment arrives from a vendor, you give it a unique lot number. Think of that lot number as a little bucket, a container that holds all the important vendor-specific info for that batch.
So how do you actually do this in Oracle? Well, first, you'll use your approved supplier list, your ASL, to keep your sourcing rules in check. Next, you just go to the item and flick the switch for full lot control. It's that simple. Now, when a shipment comes in, you capture all those vendor details right there at the lot level, probably using what's called a descriptive flex field, or DFF. And for the grand finale, if you're running the warehouse management system, WMS, you can use a feature called cost groups to neatly segregate the costs for each vendor's lot.
So what's the good and the bad here? Well, the biggest win by far is no SKU explosion. That massive problem just goes away. You get real granular vendor tracking right inside your inventory, and you're using standard Oracle tools to do it. But there's always a but, right? The downside is that it does add a little bit of complexity to your operations. Your folks in the warehouse now have to think about, which lot do I pick? It's not just about grabbing the item anymore.
All right, let's look at option number 2. What if we actually do create new items, but we do it in a really smart, really contained way? I love this name for it, the controlled explosion strategy. So here's the big idea. To the outside world, to your customer, there's only one product. We'll call that the parent SKU. But behind the curtain in your warehouse, you actually have a handful of child SKUs, and each of those child SKUs is tied to a specific vendor, or maybe a vendor type, like one for imported and one for domestic.
And you pull this off using standard Oracle stuff, like item relationships or cross-references. Now the key, and this is the key to making this work and not ending up with that 80,000 item nightmare, is discipline. You have to be super strict, only creating child items when there's a legitimate business reason. And you've got to use automation and templates to make sure it's done right every single time.
The upside to this approach? It's all about clarity. I mean, your cost and margin tracking becomes absolutely pristine. Reporting is a dream because you're dealing with distinct items. And in the warehouse, everything is separated, crystal clear. But what's the cost of all this clarity? Well, it demands rock-solid data governance. You are, after all, managing more items than you were before, and that process has to be locked down tight.
Okay, time for our third and final option. Let's call this one the reporting fix. And this is for the team that wants to disrupt their warehouse operations as little as humanly possible.
Yeah, the whole philosophy here is basically leave the warehouse alone. Keep your one SKU, don't worry about lot control, don't introduce any new procedures for the team on the floor. Instead, you're going to solve the entire tracking problem later on in the reporting layer with your BI tools.
So how does this magic work? It's pretty straightforward. When a shipment comes in, you just capture the vendor's name in a custom field on the PO receipt transaction. That's it for the operations side. Then you hand it over to your business intelligence team, your BI gurus. They're the ones who build the reports that stitch together the transaction data and the purchase order info to calculate your costs and margins. All that heavy lifting, all the complex logic, it lives entirely in the BI layer, totally separate from your core inventory. The plus side here is huge. You can't deny it. Your warehouse team literally doesn't have to change a single thing they do. But the trade-off? Oh, it's a big one. The major downside is that your inventory is now physically all mixed together. When someone goes to pick an item, they have absolutely no idea if they're grabbing the one from the domestic supplier or the imported one. And maybe more importantly, your official margin numbers are now completely dependent on this separate BI system being right. All right, we've seen the three options. Now it's time for the main event. Let's put them head to head and see who comes out on top. Let's break this down. First up, avoiding that SKU explosion. Lot control and the BI layer both get a big green check mark. Child items gets a warning because, well, it's a controlled explosion. Next, vendor cost tracking and margin accuracy. Here, lot control and child items are solid. The BI option gets another warning flag because all that logic is happening outside the system. Now, this one's huge, warehouse control. Being able to actually pick the right vendor's product. Lot control and child items nail it. The BI layer fails completely. It gets a big red X. For selling different versions online, child items is really the only one that shines. And finally, implementation effort. The BI fix is the easiest, low effort. Lot control is in the middle. And creating child items, that's definitely the highest effort of the three. So after all that, after weighing the pros and cons, a pretty clear winner starts to emerge, especially if we're talking about a company that's looking to scale up. And here it is. The verdict is option 1. For a distribution company that's growing, the lot control strategy really is the cleanest, most effective compromise you can make. So why is it the winner? Well, it just hits that perfect sweet spot. It's kind of the best of all worlds. You get to keep your SKU structure simple, which makes sales and planning happy. You get true physical separation of inventory in the warehouse. Your financials stay accurate right inside Oracle. It's built to scale as you grow. And maybe the most important reason of all, you completely sidestep that data governance nightmare of creating 80,000 new SKUs. And that brings us to the big takeaway, the thing I really want you to remember from all this. The problem isn't really about SKUs. It's about identity. You have a data identity problem. And the most important strategic question you have to answer is, where are we going to define that identity? Are you going to do it at the item level, at the lot level, or are you going to push it all the way down to the reporting layer? Because whichever you choose, believe me, that decision will ripple through your entire business.